Hi guys, so this is going to be a wrap-up video of all the non-fiction that I read since I last made a video like this, which was last August. All the non-fiction, that is, except for Permanent Record by Edward Snowden's memoirs, which I read and reviewed last September in a single review video. So I have 5 books left to talk about. None of them particularly blew me away, but none of them were particularly objectionable or contained any really problematic stuff. So this is going to be a quick one. The first book that I'd like to show you is Mountains of the Mind by Robert Macfarlane. I've had this on my radar for quite some time because it's Robert Macfarlane. So this is the history of the image of mountains in Western civilization and of their place in public consciousness in the West for the last 3 centuries. The book starts with the emergence of geology as a natural science, which happened very late in the history of natural sciences because geology is the one natural science which is least reconcilable with the idea that the world was created about 6,000 years ago. And with the rise of geology, the public became more fascinated by mountains and more interested in mountaineering as a pastime and as a very serious pursuit. This is only partly a matter of causation. It's also a matter of coincidence, just because the world started to get smaller at the time and tourism started to become a thing. So this is Robert Macfarlane's first book, excluding academic publications. And I think that there are worlds between this one and his next book, which is The Wild Places, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And I'm not saying that this is a bad book. I just think that at this point, Robert Macfarlane wasn't as skilled yet as he would later become in interweaving personal anecdotes and general history and trivia. And I couldn't really connect to this book as well as I could to the other ones of his that I've read. I don't think the topic was presented in a particularly interesting way, and I thought it was quite repetitive, yet at the same time strangely superficial. He doesn't really go into any depth with the philosophical implications of mountaineering and really everything that he talks about. I still learned a lot of interesting details, as is witnessed by the host of post-its that I put into this book, but it just wasn't the compelling reading experience that I'd hoped to get out of it, seeing as the author is Robert Macfarlane, who is one of my favorite authors. So, bit of a letdown, still not a bad book, and if you're interested in mountaineering, this will certainly be a fascinating read. My next book is, rather uncharacteristically for me, a true crime book, Conan Doyle for the Defense by Margalit. This book is about a real-life murder case which started in Glasgow in 1908, in which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle became involved when the trial ended in the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. This man was built up as the prime suspect by the police, even though there was no real evidence against him, and the whole case, from the arrest to the trial and the sentence, was one gross miscarriage of justice. The victim, Oscar Slater, was convicted of the murder of an elderly, rich, upper-middle-class woman, and he was first sentenced to death, but as per usual, his sentence was then commuted to hard labor for life. And he spent nearly 2 decades in a prison/labor camp in Peterhead on the northeast coast of Scotland, north of Aberdeen, before his champions were able to get his name cleared. It took them so long because they were up against the establishment in the police as well as the justice system. And when people began to voice doubts about the conviction and the whole process that led there, the police closed ranks and protected their own. And quite a few people got their careers destroyed in the fight for Oscar Slater. Oscar Slater's champions were also up against Victorian sensibility, which still dominated society at the beginning of the 20th century. And while Oscar Slater was by no means the very picture of a villain, he still made people uncomfortable. He was known as a gambler, his mistress was a prostitute, and most damning of all, he was an Eastern European Jewish immigrant, and it was the heyday of anti-Semitic sentiment in Britain. So, all in all, Oscar Slater was the perfect scapegoat for the police, who, of course, was under pressure from the public to solve the murder of this respectable elderly woman. So, this is a very shocking case for sure. Unfortunately, the book is still a total yawn. This is one of those cases of a book which should have been a magazine article, because there really isn't that much material here that it warrants a whole 300-page book, but that's what Margalit Fox wrote, and it is quite repetitive. And if you aren't either completely unfamiliar with the time and with miscarriage of justice in general, or a die-hard Arthur Conan Doyle / Sherlock Holmes fan, this book is bloated with so much unnecessary stuff, like extensive quotation from the correspondence of Oscar Slater, whole letters and exchanges of letters with members of his family, and quotations from Sherlock Holmes stories, like I think almost half the story of the Blue Carbuncle is quoted, and Arthur Conan Doyle's childhood is described, and how is that immediately relevant to the case at hand? And Margalit Fox repeats herself over and over again when it comes to Victorian prejudice and how the police investigation and the trial were rigged. Fortunately, because all this stuff was so basic, I was able to skim read, and I skim read the whole second half, if not 2/3 of the book. So yeah, I'd say stay away from this and read the Wikipedia article instead. And my next 3 books and my last 3 books are all history books, and they are all German publications, but at least the first one has already been translated into English, which is especially high praise since it is a scholarly publication. It is Günther Hölbl's History of the Ptolemaic Empire. The Ptolemies are the dynasty that ruled in Egypt from after the death of Alexander the Great until the Roman conquest, and the famous suicide of the seventh Cleopatra in 30 BCE. The Ptolemies are sometimes referred to as the last pharaohs. This is the best history of the Ptolemaic Empire that is currently on the market, if you ask me. And it is especially refreshing since the author is an Egyptologist as well as a historian of classical antiquity. And coming from the Egyptology side of it, he dispenses with a lot of the underlying colonial attitudes that you still find to this day in so many publications by scholars of classical antiquity. It is, however, hellishly detailed, and it demands quite a lot of the reader. It is one of those publications that are suitable for a general audience as well as an academic one, and you can quote this in scholarly publications. If you want a more general overview and you are able to read German, I recommend Stefan Pfeiffer's History of the Ptolemaic Empire. I read this recently to refreshen my memory on some aspects and was quite pleasantly surprised by it. I have disagreed with the author a lot in my own research in the past, but that was in the details. I was happy to see that in his portrayal of the development of the Ptolemaic kingdom and dynasty, the author does not fall into the same annoying narrative that scholars have followed for 100 years and more. And you can also tell that Stefan Pfeiffer has reflected on the vocabulary that he uses to describe the character of Ptolemaic kingship, and that he does not want to perpetuate the same prejudiced and sometimes again colonial attitudes that scholars have been repeating mindlessly and unreflectedly for decades. And I very much appreciate that, and that is very important to me in my own research too. And my last book is loosely connected with this because it was written by an Egyptologist, but it is written in German and it has not yet been translated. Other works by this author have been translated into English, but this is a relatively new book, his latest one, I think. So since this is only of interest to German speakers, the last 2 minutes or so of this video are going to be in German. To those of you who don't understand German, thank you for watching this video and I'll see you very soon. So, das deutschsprachige Buch, das ich gelesen habe, das dritte deutschsprachige Buch, war Achsenzeit von Jan Assmann. Hier im Symbolbild, weil es aus der Bibliothek war. Jan Assmann ist ein großer und berühmter Ägyptologe, aber er ist auch über den Horizont der Ägyptologie hinaus bekannt für seine kulturtheoretischen Schriften. Ich selbst bin ihm das erste Mal begegnet im Grundstudium Germanistik, wo wir für die Kulturtheorie Exzerpte aus das kulturelle Gedächtnis gelesen haben. Dann 2018 ist er schlagartig noch berühmter geworden, als er zusammen mit seiner Frau den Friedenspreis des deutschen Buchhandels gewonnen hat. Aber egal. Achsenzeit ist ein Stück Wissenschaftsgeschichte. Es beschäftigt sich mit dem Umgang mit der Idee der Achsenzeit, die schon vor Hegel formuliert wurde und dann seit Hegel schlagartig Popularität gewonnen hat in der Wissenschaft. Mit Achsenzeit ist die Zeit um 500 vor Christus gemeint, in der die Zivilisation, die westliche Zivilisation natürlich, grundlegende geistige Errungenschaften hervorgebracht hat, die die Geschichte und Geistesgeschichte im Westen nachhaltig beeinflusst haben, bis heute beeinflussen. Und als man dann ein bisschen tiefer gebuddelt hat und weiter um sich geblickt hat, hat man im Vorderen Orient und im Fernen Osten zur selben Zeit ähnliche Entwicklungen gesehen und diese zeitliche Koinzidenz hat zu einer Entwicklung dieses Gedankens der Achsenzeit geführt, die fast mythische Dimensionen hat. Und Jan Assmann verfolgt diesen Mythos nun von seiner Entstehung bis in die zweite Hälfte des 20. Jahrhunderts. Das Buch tut im Grunde genau das, was sein Untertitel ist. Der Untertitel lautet Eine Archäologie der Moderne. Und wie die Archäologen legt Jan Assmann die verschiedenen Schichten dieses Mythos offen. Dennoch bleibt das Buch ein wenig hinter dem zurück, was ich mir nach der Lektüre der Einleitung davon versprochen hatte. Ich hatte erwartet, dass Assmann etwas weniger reine Dekonstruktion der Texte zum Mythos Achsenzeit vornimmt und etwas mehr und auffälliger kritisch Stellung nimmt und vielleicht zumindest die Anfänge eines Gegenentwurfs macht. Denn für mich ist reine Wissenschaftsgeschichte etwas zu wenig. Ich frage mich dann, ja, und wozu hat er das jetzt gemacht? Okay, vielleicht damit jemand anderes dann da ansetzt und den Gegenentwurf schreibt, aber ich hätte den gerne jetzt schon gelesen in diesem Buch. Also auf jeden Fall interessant, wenn man Wissenschaftsgeschichte lesen möchte, aber wenn man, wie ich, dann gerne auch einen zeitgemäßen Gegenentwurf hätte, dann wird man auf dem Trockenen sitzen gelassen. Ich möchte trotzdem nicht von dem Buch abraten. Ich denke nur, dass andere Bücher von Jan Assmann dann etwas befriedigender sind in der Hinsicht. Und zum Abschluss auch nochmal auf Deutsch. Danke fürs Ansehen und hoffentlich bis bald.